Jupiter in the third house, expanding conversation. Welcome to Jupiter in the third house in synastry. In this overlay, we explore what happens when one person's Jupiter falls into another person's third house, the house of communication, the immediate mind, siblings, short journeys, and the everyday exchange of information and idea. This overlay does not announce itself through the magnetism of Jupiter in the first, nor through the material relief of Jupiter in the second. Its register is verbal, mental, and curiously light. It shows up in conversation, in the quality of exchange between two people, in the sense that talking to this person makes one's own mind feel bigger, quicker, more capable of connecting ideas that previously sat in separate rooms. Where Jupiter in the second expands what someone has, Jupiter in the third expands what someone thinks, says, and is able to articulate. The nature of Jupiter itself remains the governing fact of every overlay it touches, and the third house is no exception to its terms. Jupiter is the greater benefice, operating through increase rather than precision. It does not refine the way Mercury refines, sorting and categorizing and getting the details exactly right. It enlarges. It opens more avenues than it closes, generates more possibility than it tests, and trusts more readily than it verifies. This is, in most houses, a genuinely welcome quality. In the third house, the house most associated with Mercury's own domain of careful, exact communication, Jupiter's expansiveness produces something distinctive. Real intellectual generosity, paired with a tendency to overstate, to generalize, and occasionally to mistake enthusiasm for accuracy. The third house, in traditional astrology, governs the everyday mind, perception, speech, short correspondence, the relationship with siblings, the immediate environment one moves through and reports on. It is also, in the Hellenistic House of Joy doctrine, the house in which the moon rejoices, reflecting the third's association with the responsive, changeable, instinctive layer of mind, rather than the higher, structured reasoning of the ninth house, which is Mercury's broader domain by extension, and the house of true philosophy. Jupiter holds no dignity here, no domicile, no exaltation, no joy. And this is worth naming honestly, rather than overstating, since this overlay is sometimes spoken of as though Jupiter were entirely at home in the third. It is not. What Jupiter brings to the third house, it brings as a guest with considerable charm, rather than as a placement with formal claim to the territory. That distinction matters for understanding both the overlay's genuine gifts and its characteristic excess. From the Jupiter person's perspective, the house person's mind and manner of speaking are often experienced as something worth drawing out. The Jupiter person may find themselves naturally encouraging the house person to speak more, to elaborate, to follow a thought further than the house person might otherwise have taken it alone. There is frequently a real intellectual generosity here, the Jupiter person listening with an expansiveness that makes the house person's ordinary observations feel more interesting, more worth saying than they perhaps are in other company. The Jupiter person may also bring new ideas, new frames of reference, a wider vocabulary of concepts into the house person's everyday thinking, broadening the scope of what the house person's mind has to work with. From the house person's perspective, the experience is often one of mental enlargement. Conversation with the Jupiter person tends to feel unusually generative. Ideas connect to other ideas more readily. The house person finds themselves saying things they had not quite articulated before. And the ordinary business of communication takes on a quality of discovery rather than mere exchange. The house person may notice that they think more expansively around the Jupiter person, that their habitual mental patterns loosen slightly, admitting more possibility than they ordinarily would. There is often real pleasure in this, the simple, accumulating pleasure of being someone whose thoughts feel worth having, in the company of someone who treats them that way. At its most constructive, this overlay produces a relationship rich in genuine intellectual exchange, one in which both people feel sharper, more curious, and more articulate for having known each other. The Jupiter person's natural generosity toward ideas gives the house person room to think out loud without fear of correction or diminishment, which over time can produce real growth in the house person's confidence as a communicator. Conversations under this overlay tend to range widely, across topics, across registers of seriousness and play, and there is frequently a shared appetite for learning, for trading books, articles, and observations, for treating the everyday traffic of talk as something worth savouring rather than merely getting through. Siblings, neighbours, and the immediate community often factor pleasantly into this overlay as well, since the third house's domain extends to these connections, and Jupiter's presence tends to make such relationships feel easier and more abundant than they otherwise might. And yet Jupiter's characteristic shadow asserts itself here in a register specific to the third house's concerns: language, accuracy, and the everyday transmission of information. Where Jupiter's excess in the first house inflates the self, and in the second house inflates material expectation, in the third house it inflates speech itself, producing a tendency toward exaggeration, toward generalizing past the point the actual evidence supports, toward a kind of expansive storytelling that prioritizes the size and shape of the idea over its strict correspondence to fact. This is rarely deliberate deception. It is, more often, enthusiasm outrunning precision, the Jupiter person genuinely believing the larger, more colourful version of events they are relaying, because Jupiter's nature is to perceive things in their most expanded and meaningful form rather than their most literal one. This shadow has a particular consequence for the house person, whose third house, their own faculty of everyday reasoning and communication, is the terrain being expanded. If the Jupiter person's enthusiasm is left unchecked, the house person may find themselves absorbing not just expanded confidence, but expanded inaccuracy, taking on board claims, plans, or interpretations that have not been carefully verified, simply because they were offered with such evident conviction and goodwill. The conversational ease that makes this overlay so pleasant can also make it harder for the house person to apply their own ordinary critical filters, since questioning the Jupiter person's account can feel, in the moment, like an unwelcome deflation of something that otherwise feels generous and alive. There is also a subtler pattern worth naming around follow-through. Jupiter generates ideas, plans, and possibilities with real fluency, but the third house's domain is the everyday and immediate rather than the sustained and structural. And Jupiter's enthusiasm does not, on its own, supply the discipline required to see a given idea through to a concrete and accurate conclusion. A relationship under this overlay can accumulate a long, pleasurable history of plans discussed, trips half arranged, projects enthusiastically begun in conversation, many of which dissolve quietly for want of the more exacting attention that actually finishing requires. The talk is genuinely good. Whether it converts reliably into accurate, completed action is a separate question, and one this overlay does not answer on its own. The distinction between this overlay's nourishing and inflating expressions tends to rest on whether its evident verbal abundance is paired with honest verification. Jupiter expands the felt sense of an idea's worth. It does not, by itself, check the idea against the facts. When the Jupiter person's enthusiasm is matched by a genuine respect for accuracy, when big claims are followed up, when generous interpretations are checked against what actually happened, this overlay produces real intellectual flourishing. When that checking is absent, the same fluency produces a relationship built partly on stories that feel true because they were told so well, rather than because they were verified to be so. At its highest expression, Jupiter in the third house creates a relationship of genuine mental expansion, wide-ranging conversation, mutual intellectual encouragement, and a shared appetite for ideas that makes the ordinary traffic of daily communication feel unusually alive. The Jupiter person's natural generosity toward thought gives the house person room to think more freely and speak more confidently. The house person, in turn, gives the Jupiter person an audience whose genuine engagement makes the Jupiter person's enthusiasm feel purposeful rather than merely diffuse. When balanced, Jupiter in the third house creates intellectual generosity, expanded curiosity, easy and abundant conversation, and a relationship in which both people's everyday thinking feels enlarged rather than constrained. When imbalanced, it can produce exaggeration, unchecked claims, plans discussed more often than completed, and a conversational ease that occasionally substitutes for the harder discipline of accuracy and follow-through. At its core, this overlay is about the experience of thinking and speaking more expansively in someone else's company, of having one's ordinary mind treated as something larger and more interesting than it perhaps is elsewhere. The question it poses, and that only the two people involved can answer, is whether what gets said between them is being tested against what is actually true, or whether it is, for now, simply the pleasurable and unverified feeling of a bigger and better conversation.
This was Jupiter in the third house in Synastry Overlays. Thank you for listening. Next, Jupiter in the fourth house.